Hello, I'm Dr. Harold Koenig, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about methodology with regard to studies on religion and health. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and then we'll proceed with the talk. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now. And I will bring up my PowerPoint. And by the way, if any of you would like a PDF of the PowerPoint, I'm happy to share that as well. Okay, so let's begin. First of all, just a little bit of information about myself if you don't know my background. My area of expertise is as a healthcare professional who has treated patients for nearly 40 years. I'm also a clinical researcher and epidemiologist by training on the relationship between religion and health, and have been doing this for over 35 years. I have more than 550 scientific peer-reviewed publications and have written 55 books. I'm a devout Christian, but more like a Muslim Christian, as I seek every day to submit my life to the one and only indivisible God. And many of my beliefs about God and God's laws are very, very similar to those of Muslims. So I feel a real brotherhood with my Muslim colleagues. I've read the Bible repeatedly and the Quran repeatedly, and to some extent have familiarity with the Hadith and the Sunnah, and have written 2 books on Islam and health. I have many, many colleagues who are Sunni and Shia Muslims, including some of my closest friends with whom I have actually worshiped together in a mosque. I've been working with Iranian researchers now for over a decade and have nearly 50 co-authored publications with those Iranian co-authors, many of them on religion and health. Okay, so I'm going to talk about methodology, but I'm going to focus on measurement, because really measurement is where it all begins. So I'm going to cover categories of measurement, talk about dimensions of religion and religiousness, describe to you some religion-specific scales, critique some of the common scales, provide examples of scales, talk about how to develop a scale from scratch, and then talk a little bit about translation of scales into another language. I may not get to these last 2 topics, but I have a paper that will be coming out in the Journal of Religion and Health that goes over the steps for scale translation into another language, and also how to validate, psychometrically validate a scale in different settings, either a new scale or psychometrically validate an existing scale in another language. So I think those will be extremely helpful for all of you who are interested in doing research in this area, and possibly using different scales that you might develop yourself or that you might translate into Persian or Farsi. Okay, so just basically, you've got 2 categories of measurement. There's qualitative measurement, where the focus is on a person's story, the details of personal experience. There's an attempt to derive patterns in those experiences and meaning and understanding of the person's experiences. So this is where one might do anywhere up to 20 or 30 interviews and those interviews would be recorded, and then they would be transcribed, and then statistical software would be used to develop patterns in the responses. The other category is quantitative, where the focus is on numbers, amounts of, or degrees of something. Quantitative research seeks to objectify. It looks for numerical correlations and predictions. It seeks to assess impact or change in terms of numbers. Now, very popular today is what is called mixed methods, where there is a mixture of both quantitative and qualitative methods that are used to, first of all, obtain the statistical relationships, the quantitative statistical relationships or predictions, and also to help to explain those relationships through asking questions that might be considered qualitative in nature. Now, today I'm going to focus on quantitative research, which I'm sure many of you are involved in, and that's my area of specific expertise. And of course, the core of quantitative measurement, of quantitative research, involves measurement. Okay, so what are the purposes of measurement? Well, what you're going to do, you are going to need to measure predictors and outcomes. So predictors in this case would be level of religious belief, behavior, or commitment. That would be your predictor. And you would be predicting outcomes such as mental health, social health, behavioral health, physical health, or in some cases, you might even be interested in religious or spiritual well-being as an outcome itself. So I've heard a lot from my colleagues that they're interested in studying the changes, for example, in of interventions on a person's spiritual well-being or their religious well-being, and there are measures of those. But you have to really kind of keep those measures of spiritual or religious well-being separate from your predictors. Okay, so those are the spiritual or religious well-being is more like an outcome. It's not really a predictor, because when you use those outcomes as predictors of mental or physical health, there's a lot of overlap in the definitions, and we don't want to have overlap. We want to be very clear on what our predictors are and what our outcomes are. Okay, so first of all, we have to try to distinguish, we've distinguished predictors and outcomes. Now we have to distinguish religion from spirituality. Now, religiosity involves beliefs, practices, and rituals related to the transcendent, where the transcendent is God in Western religious traditions. This may involve beliefs about spirits or angels or demons, usually involves specific beliefs about life after death and rules to guide behaviors in this life. Religion is often organized and practiced within a community, but it can also be practiced alone and in private outside of an institution. Religion is a unique construct whose definition is generally agreed upon. Now, spirituality in the last 20 years has really come about in terms of academic research. One of the reasons is because many researchers are uncomfortable with religion. So this popular expression of spirituality has emerged. And one of the reasons is to measure something that doesn't include religion. That's why the term spirituality came about, largely because of the negative opinions and attitudes of scientific researchers towards religion. So they now have jumped onto this term called spirituality, which is, it's considered something personal, something individuals define for themselves. It's often free of any rules or regulations or responsibilities associated with religion. It's free of any laws or rules or moral values or anything, really. It's whatever the person defines it that it means for themselves. One can be spiritual but not religious. Thus, spirituality is seen as non-divisive and common to all, both religious and secular. The term spirituality can be very useful in clinical settings where you will take a spiritual history or try to identify spiritual needs and address those spiritual needs. However, because of its vague and nebulous nature, because it's largely self-defined and it can mean virtually anything to anyone, it's difficult to measure and quantify. For that reason, whatever you're going to measure, be sure that it's religion, not this diffuse spirituality. Now, you can call it spiritual. That's okay, because if you're trying to write a grant or write a paper in order to get it published or in order to get the grant, you may need to call it spiritual. But if you're going to measure something, be sure that you're measuring religion. So, that's the way it is in the US here. Nobody likes religion. They like spirituality. And so we use the spiritual language as we write our grants and papers. But what we're measuring, or at least what our group is measuring, is religion. I've often described religion as the engine that runs the car. Like maybe spirituality is more like the car frame, but without religion, that car is not going anywhere. You've got to have an engine, and that engine is religion. Okay, so there are various dimensions or aspects of religion and religiousness that one might want to measure. There is religious denomination or affiliation. Asking a person, are you Christian? If you're Christian, are you Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox? Are you Muslim? Are you Shia Muslim? Or are you a Sunni Muslim? Are you a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jewish person? So those are the kinds of things you would want to measure to start out, because you've got to get some information about the person's background. Next, there's religious belief or orthodoxy of belief. This is where you are actually trying to measure to what degree does the subject or the participant in the research, to what degree do they abide by the orthodox, the conservative beliefs that are documented in the original scriptures of the tradition. For example, the Bible or the Quran. To what degree is the person believing the orthodox teachings of the Quran, for example? So that would be religious belief or orthodoxy. Then there are public religious practices, such as worshiping in the mosque, or gathering together in a community in some way and worshiping God. There are private religious practices, such as prayer and meditation, and that might involve reciting the Quran or reading the Quran or listening to the Quran being recited or listening to religious music, or possibly sermons on the radio or on CD. Next, there are subjective religiousness or importance of religion. For example, how important is religion in your daily life? There's religious motivation or commitment. This is one of the most important dimensions in my understanding. I really want to be able to measure how deeply religious is that participant, because I think the depth of a person's religious faith, the strength of their faith, that is what is the main factor in driving a person's mental, physical, social, and behavioral health. Without faith and trust in God, it doesn't really work. So that's kind of the basis for all of this, is a person's connection with God, love of God, submission to God and God's will and God's laws that he has made very clear in the Quran and in the Bible. Okay, then there is religious well-being. So that's a measure of to what extent is a person's relationship with God a good one, a loving one, a trusting one. Next, there is religious coping. Religious coping involves religious behaviors or beliefs that we would turn to in order to cope with stress or loss or trauma. And so there are measures of ways that people use religion to cope, and we'll go over all of these. There is religious history. In other words, to what extent has a person throughout their lifetime been involved in religious activity, and how deeply religious have they been throughout their lifespan? So many people may be only religious for a few years. They may have turned to religion in middle age or even later life. But what is the total exposure to religious belief and religious commitment over a person's lifetime? That is really what we need to know about. It's very similar to the effect that cigarette smoking has on health. We don't just ask a person, how many cigarettes do you smoke a day now? We ask them, for how many years have you smoked, and how many packs of cigarettes per day have you smoked over those years? In fact, that particular measurement is called pack years of smoking. So that's the exposure of smoking. What is the exposure to smoking has the person had? The same applies to religion. To what extent have they been exposed to religion, and to what degree throughout their lifetime, from childhood onwards? So that's a very important aspect of religiosity that we don't really have good measures to assess, but those measures need to be developed, and they could be done fairly simply. It's just a matter of including time in terms of the exposure to the religious involvement. Next, there is religious support. In other words, the support that a person receives from their mosque, from other members of their religious faith. So that's important. And also, how much support does an individual give to other members of their religious faith? To what extent? And also, actually, this particular measure, there is a measure of religious support. It also assesses negative interactions within one's mosque or church or whatever, and that goes into it too. There are religious experiences. For example, the experience of God in one's life, the actual experience of God, love of God, surrender to God, submission to God, and all of the reward that one experiences as a result of believing in God and seeking God. There is reward in that. And so, those are the mental and physical health outcomes, so we don't want to confuse the predictors and the outcomes now, but I'm kind of talking about the effects that religion may have on a person. And part of those effects involve, religious experiences. And also there's religious giving. How much of your money do you give to the mosque or for religious reasons? How much of your income? How much of all of your assets do you give? The zakat, I believe it's called. I'm not sure, but there's an Arabic word for it. I'm not sure what the Persian word is for it, or the Farsi word for it, but it's the percentage of all of what you own. How much of that do you give each year for religious reasons, for, to help others, from a religious standpoint? Then there is religious knowledge. How much do you know about your religious faith? How much do you know about the Quran? Have you read the Quran? and you know, there are questions that you can ask that assess the extent of knowledge that a person has about their religious faith. Islam. So knowledge about Islam is also important, because unless you know what the Quran and what the Hadith say, unless you know what they say, you can't live that way. So you've got to know what the teachings are, otherwise you're not going to be able to live according to those teachings. So knowledge, religious knowledge, is important. Then there's religious growth. To what extent has a person grown? Has their religious faith matured over time? And then yeah, so that's basically that. Okay, so now here are some scales that are used for research purposes. These are 7 of the most commonly used scales. I just wanted to mention them, and then we'll go over each scale and the items on the scale. You've always got to look at the actual items of a scale, the questions that are on the scale, before deciding on whether or not to use the scale. So these 7 scales are the Intrinsic Religiosity Scale of Hoge. That consists of 10 items. There's the Duke University Religion Index. That's a 5-item measure of religious practices and religious commitment. There is, it's been validated in Farsi and Persian in several studies, so that is definitely available for Iranian researchers to use. My favorite, though, is the Belief into Action Scale. It's also validated in Farsi or Persian, and I'm happy to send you the article that it was validated in. You know, just have to let me know, email me. Then there is the Religious Commitment Inventory. It consists of 10 items. It's a good measure, and I'll show it to you. There's the Spiritual Well-Being Scale. Now, this can be used either as a measure of religious well-being or as a measure of existential well-being. There are 2 subscales that make up this spiritual well-being scale. It's very important to keep these 2 subscales separate. Okay, so the existential well-being subscale is a measure of psychological well-being. It has really nothing to do with religion. It's all about well-being or meaning and purpose. You know, that's an outcome of religion. That's not religion itself. Now, religious well-being, that subscale, that's more valid. You could, you know, because it's assessing a person's relationship with God. You have a strong relationship with God, you might want to see whether or not that affects your mental or physical health or social health or your behavioral health. Then there are the positive and negative religious coping scales. This is by Pargamet, Ken Pargamet, and it consists of 14 items. There are 7 items that are assessing positive religious coping and 7 items assessing negative religious coping. And again, we'll go over those. And then the Daily Spiritual Experiences Scale. I'm not really excited about any of the spirituality scales because they're often, the way they're made up is they're made up of items assessing mental health. And so therefore they're contaminated with these mental health items. But this Daily Spiritual Experiences Scale is not bad. It's got some problems with it. It's some of the items are basically indicators of mental health. So you have to be careful when you use it, but we'll talk about that when I describe the scale. Okay, so recommended measures. If you use any measure, I would use the Belief into Action Scale. It's one that I developed after studying this area for over 35 years. You know, so I think it captures what you need to know about a person's religious faith. So we'll go over that. Next is the Hoge 10-item intrinsic religiosity scale. And that's a good scale. It's a scale that I've used really since the beginning of my research, because again, I was interested in how deeply religious a person was. Was it the center of their life? Or was the person just using religion for some other reason? Maybe in order to look good in public, or, to just maybe for their business, because people who are religious are often seen as people who are good and who do good business. So some people use that in order to get better business or make more money. And that's not good. That's not an intrinsic way of believing or having faith. So this particular measure assesses the intrinsic religious faith. In other words, to what extent is a person's belief and commitment to religion, is that the first thing in their life, and everything else is secondary? That's what these intrinsic religiosity scales are measuring. Okay, and then the third one might be the religious commitment inventory that Worthington has developed. That's a good one too, but I don't think as good as these first two. And then the shortest one, of course, is the DUREL, the 5-item DUREL. The DUREL now, because of its short length, is probably the most commonly used scale now in the world. Okay, the best overall religious coping scale is the brief RCOPE. Now, there are several Muslim religious coping scales. So that's something you should be aware of. You may want to look through those Muslim religious coping scales in order to identify one that you can use. But, the brief RCOPE, even though it was developed, in English and here in the United States, is still a good religious coping scale. It covers the two areas of positive and negative religious coping very well. Now the overall best spiritual well-being scale is this one by Palutzian and Ellison. But again, just remember that it includes these two subscales that you have to keep apart: the religious well-being and the existential well-being. Don't just lump those together. That's a very bad idea. Look at them separately. Oftentimes, like I said earlier, religious well-being as the real measure of religiosity or religious commitment, then predicting existential well-being, then predicting mental and physical health outcomes. So it's kind of a sequenced model when you're examining the relationships here, that it's the religious well-being that leads to the existential well-being or the meaning and purpose in life, which then leads to better mental and physical health. Okay. And then the daily spiritual experiences scale, I think it's the best overall spirituality scale. Okay, so let's look at these scales. Again, don't choose a scale just because it's used a lot, or even because it's been psychometrically validated. Now, all of these scales I'm going to show you have been psychometrically validated. So you do want to use one that's psychometrically validated, but be sure that it's measuring what you want it to measure. So you have to look at the items in order to determine that. So here we go. So here first, I'm going to describe this 10-item Hoge intrinsic religiosity scale. It was published in 1972, so it's been around for a long time. And it's actually focuses on these two dimensions of intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. This intrinsic, extrinsic religiosity was an idea developed by Gordon Allport at Harvard. He was a psychologist at Harvard who was interested in separating out people who claimed to be religious, but some of them were intrinsically religious, whereas others were extrinsically religious. The extrinsically religious person was thought to use religion as a means to some other more important end, Whereas the intrinsic person, for the intrinsic person, religion was the end in itself. Okay, so here are the actual items. So item number one, my faith involves all of my life. You know, all of my life is submitted to God. In my life, I experience the presence of the divine, of God, of Allah, experiencing God's presence in your life. This third one is actually an extrinsic item. Although I am a religious person, I refuse to let religious considerations influence my everyday affairs. So depending on how that's responded to, that is scored in reverse. So people actually lose points if they agree with that statement. Nothing is as important to me as serving God as best I know how. My faith sometimes restricts my actions. In other words, my faith, affects how I live my life. It affects what I do in life, how I behave in life. Next is my religious beliefs are what really lie behind my whole approach to life. Now, this one of all 10 items, this one question is the strongest predictor of health outcomes. We've been able to show that this one question, question number 6, or statement number 6, my religious beliefs are what really lie behind my whole approach to life. That is if you only ask this one question, if you had to ask one question, this would be the question that I would recommend. If you had only room for one question. Now, if you had room for 2 questions, I would encourage you to measure frequency of attendance at religious services, because that is the other religious indicator that strongly predicts health outcomes of all kinds. Okay, but this one right here, of the religious commitment items, this is the one that predicts the strongest. My religious beliefs are what really lie behind my whole approach to life. Next is number 7. I try hard to carry my religion over into all of my other dealings in life. Then one should seek God's guidance when making every important decision. You can see how these are all of these intrinsic items are tapping the degree to which a person's faith is the core, is the center of their life. Next, these last 2 are actually extrinsic items. Although I believe in religion, I feel there are many more important things in life. Wrong. It doesn't matter so much what I believe as long as I lead a moral life. Wrong. It does matter what you believe. Those beliefs are critical, and they are what help a person to lead a moral life. All right. Okay, so anyway, so that's that scale. Now here's the 10-item religious commitment inventory. I said that this was good too. I often read books and magazines about my faith. I make financial contributions to my religious organization. I spend time trying to grow in understanding of my faith. Religion is especially important to me because it answers many questions about the meaning of life. My religious beliefs lie behind my whole approach to life. Again, I think that Worthington took that one question from the intrinsic religiosity subscale that we just talked about. Religious beliefs influence all my dealings in life. Again, this is from the intrinsic scale that we just went over. It is important to me to spend periods of time in private religious thought and reflection. So that's good. I enjoy working in the activities of my religious affiliation. And 10, I keep well informed about my local religious group and have some influence in its decisions. Again, that question kind of taps to what degree is the person involved in their religious community. Okay, so that's that. Now for my favorite scale. Naturally, I'm biased because I developed this scale, but nevertheless, here's the citation for it. And here are the questions. So question number 1. Please circle the highest priority in your life now. What is most valued, most prized? Health and independence, my family, my friendships, my job, career, or business, my education, financial security, relationship with God, ability to travel and see the world, listening to music and partying. Yes, that is the highest priority for some people, and freedom to live as I choose. So all 10 of these are very important aspects of a person's life, including their family. But if a person chooses anything but item number 7, relationship with God, they choose anything else, they get a 1. If they choose 7, they get a 10. So, you know, the first thing off on this scale is it establishes that God is number one in a person's life. Next, how often do you attend religious services? Now, this is the English version, the American version. Again, the Persian version is worded differently, but the concepts are the same. So how often do you attend religious services? Never, and that's a 1, all the way up to 10 daily. Other than religious services, how often do you get together with others for religious reasons? How often do you congregate with other people of your religious faith? Never, all the way up to 10, which would be daily. To what extent have you decided, to what extent have you decided to place your life under God's direction? In other words, the very meaning of the word Muslim, which means to submit. To what extent have you submitted to God in your life? There are actually 2 items on here that try to capture this. It's item number 4, to what extent have you decided to submit your life under God's direction? And then also number 10, to what extent have you decided to conform your life to the teachings of your religious faith? Again, it involves, both of those involve submission. Next is, what percentage of your gross annual income do you give to your religious institution or to other religious causes each year? Now this is for gross annual income, but in the Muslim version, it talks about the zakat, okay? It talks about what percentage of your entire assets do you give each year for religious causes, as one of the pillars of Islam. Excuse me. Okay, on average, how much time each day do you spend? Let me get rid of this. To what extent, how much time each day in each 24 hours do you spend listening to religious music or radio, or watching religious television, or listening to the Quran be recited, etc.? On average, how much time do you spend time reading religious scriptures, books, or other religious literature like the Quran? How much time do you spend each day reading the Quran or the Hadith? And it can be never, all the way up to 5 hours or more a day. On average, how much time each day do you spend time in private prayer or meditation? On average, how much time do you spend as a volunteer in your religious community or to help others for religious reasons? And then, to what extent have you decided to conform your life to the teachings of your religious faith? The way this whole scale was developed was based on the notion that what is really important in a person's life is what they spend their time on and their money on. So time and money are going to determine really how important is something in their life. So how much time a person spends on their religion and how much money they devote to their religion, this really determines how religious a person is. And that's the whole principle behind this 10-item belief into action scale. You know, it's belief into action. It's not just about belief. Belief people can claim anything, but how does that belief affect their behavior, how they live their life? And that's what this measure is trying to capture. Okay, so let's go on now. So this is the Duke Religion Index. Again, it's available in Persian. And you can change some of the words here. How often do you worship at the mosque or engage in other religious meetings? How often do you spend time in private religious activities such as prayer, meditation, or study of the Quran? In my life, I experienced the presence of the divine, in other words, God or Allah. My beliefs are what really lie behind my whole approach to life. Again, that's that number 6. And then I try hard to carry in the intrinsic religiosity scale, number 6. And then finally, I try to carry my religion over into all of my other dealings in life. So these 3 are measuring intrinsic religious commitment, whereas this is measuring private religious activities, and this is measuring public religious activities that are done together with others. Now, here is the brief RCOPE. This is religious coping. These are the items on the positive religious coping subscale. Ken Pargament and I developed this scale. So here are the items. I look for a stronger connection with God. I sought God's love and care. I sought help from God in letting go of my anger. I tried to put my plans into action together with God. I tried to see how God might be trying to strengthen me in the situation. I asked forgiveness for my sins. I focused on religion to stop worrying about my problems. So those are the 7 items for the positive religious coping subscale. Here is the negative religious coping subscale. I wondered whether God had abandoned me. I felt punished by God for my lack of devotion. I wonder what I did for God to punish me. I questioned God's love for me. I wondered whether my church or mosque had abandoned me. I decided that the devil had made this happen. I questioned the power of God. Now, these items are assessing religious struggles that people are having with God and with their religious community. When people are suffering, when lots of bad things have happened, this life is not an easy life that we live. We are constantly dealing with change. We're losing our loved ones. We're having problems with our loved ones. We're developing sicknesses and illness, and eventually we're dying. So this is a difficult life. And sometimes when people are going through the depth of these suffering, they begin to ask questions. They wonder about God, whether God really loves them, whether God has abandoned them. They may be praying for relief of their suffering or for protection, and yet bad things are still happening. So in that situation, many people begin to struggle with their faith. And some people lose their faith entirely during these times of trial. So it's important to measure these things. Even though many people, particularly Muslims, may be embarrassed or ashamed to admit to feeling this way, it still occurs among even devout Muslims. And you need to be able to identify it, measure it, and then for practical purposes, then address those issues. Now, most of these feelings arise out of suffering and pain. And clinically, the way we deal with it is we just listen. We listen to the person talk about these painful feelings and the struggles they're having with God. We don't try to, tell them, no, that's not correct. We don't try to correct them. We just listen to them and support them, because eventually, if they feel loved by their therapist or their clinician, that they will work through this. They'll work through these struggles with God, and they'll realize in the end, or that's our goal, is for them to realize in the end that God has not abandoned them, that God is not punishing them, that God does love them, and that God is all powerful and can do anything God wants. And whatever God is doing, we may not understand it, but he knows best. And that no matter how much we're suffering, the suffering can cause something good to occur in us. It can deepen our faith. And that's the reason for the suffering. The suffering is, as the Quran indicates, it's a trial. It's a trial to make us stronger in our faith. And so, when bad things happen and when we're being refined by the fires of adversity, these feelings come up, and they have to be acknowledged, and they have to be worked through. And the way the person works it through is in a loving, supportive environment that acknowledges that this is normal to feel this way, but that it's not normal to stay feeling that way. People have to get through these religious struggles and then reconnect with God in a strong, in a strong way. Okay, so the spiritual well-being scale. Here is that scale. I told you there are two subscales. One, religious well-being, and the other, existential well-being. And don't confuse those scales, and don't combine those scales in a single, total overall score, because this subscale is assessing something that is truly religious. In other words, one's relationship with God, the quality of that relationship. So I don't find much satisfaction in private prayer with God. So this is scored in reverse, of course, because you're wanting to assess, you would say, no, that's not at all. I disagree with that strongly. I believe that God is concerned about my problems. Yes, I strongly agree. I believe that God loves me and cares about me. Strongly agree. I believe that God is impersonal and not interested in my daily situations. Strongly disagree. I don't have a personally satisfying relationship with God. Strongly disagree. I have a personally meaningful relationship with God. Strongly agree. My relationship with God helps me not to feel lonely. Strongly agree. I don't get much personal strength or support from my God. Strongly disagree. I feel most fulfilled when I'm in close communion with God, and my relationship with God contributes to my sense of well-being. So you can see how this is measuring that relationship with God, which is so critical. Now, the other one, so that's a valid measure of religiosity or religiousness. Now, this is the existential well-being subscale of this spiritual well-being scale. I don't know who I am, where I came from, or where I'm going. That's quite a statement. If you agree strongly with that, you're in trouble. So, strongly disagree, but that's, again, an indicator of well-being. The person who has strong well-being, they know who they are, they know where they came from, and they know where they're going. I don't enjoy much about life. Strongly disagree. Well-being involves enjoying life. And so, again, it's about psychological well-being. I feel that life is a positive experience. I feel good about my future. Optimism. I feel unsettled about my future. Pessimism, lack of hope. I feel that life is full of conflict and unhappiness. I feel very fulfilled and satisfied with my life. Life doesn't have much meaning. I feel a sense of well-being about the direction of my life is headed. I believe there is some real purpose for my life. So this is really assessing purpose and meaning in life, and satisfaction and happiness and optimism. So this is all about mental health. This is not anything distinctively about religion, but it is a consequence. It is an outcome of a strong relationship with God. So it's first, you score high on this, then that results in greater well-being from the psychological side. But don't combine these scales, because otherwise, or describe this as being the spiritual aspect and this then being the religious aspect. You know, don't do that. Look at them separately, measure them separately, analyze them separately, and include them as you're modeling the relationship. Include the existential well-being as a mediator of the relationship between religious well-being and mental health. This is a mediator, a step towards, but it is not, you know, it is not anything distinctively spiritual. It's an outcome. Just remember that. This is an outcome, and this is a predictor. Okay, so in summary, understand the differences between religiosity and spirituality. Remember that, you know, religiosity now, currently in the academic world in particular, that is something distinctive. That is something you can measure. That is something we can agree upon. Spirituality, the way it is now being conceived, can mean anything. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with religion. And I've encouraged people not to even use the term spirituality in terms of measuring. Now, you can use the term spirituality to describe your study, or describe the title of your paper, or describe the title of your grant that you're submitting to get money to do the work. But when you're measuring something, measure religiosity. Okay? Be aware of the different dimensions of religiosity, and try to remember also to measure exposure across the lifespan to religious faith. How many years has that person been praying regularly, been doing the 5 pillars of Islam, you know, praying 5 times a day, and all of the other things that are involved in those in Islam? To what extent over their lifetime have they been doing it? Since a small child, have they been devout in their practice, and during their middle age and during their later life? The exposure is very important across the lifespan. Understand the strengths and weaknesses of each scale, how long they are, how many items they consist of, and how commonly they are used. But more than anything else, before choosing a scale, be aware of the items that make up the scale and what they are actually measuring. Is it measuring what you want it to measure? That's the most important thing. Okay, now finally, decide on what you want to measure. Decide on what you want to measure and keep them apart. Predictors are religion, religiosity, religious commitment, religious practices, possibly religious well-being. The outcomes are, do you want to measure mental health? Do you want to measure physical health? Or do you want to measure religious or spiritual well-being? Okay, you got to keep them separate. Keep the predictors separate from the outcomes, and the outcomes separate from each other. Just remember that. Keep the predictors separate from the outcomes, and the outcomes separate from each other. Okay, now I said I would say a little bit also about translation of scales. And you know, there is a procedure. All you need to know is there is a procedure on how to translate scales, step by step. There is you know, forward translation, backward translation, and then, you know, getting everybody to agree on it, testing it out. It's more complicated than I have time now to talk to you about. But you know, soon my paper on scale development and translation, religious and spiritual scale development and translation, will be published in the Journal of Religion and Health. And I'm happy even to send you the paper before it's published, if that's what you would like to do. If you're developing a scale or translating it, or wanting to determine the psychometric properties of the scale, this paper goes goes into clear steps on how to proceed. It's not easy. It's complex, and it involves a lot of complex statistics. But this paper lays it out and refers you to other papers where experts have actually described scale translation and psychometric validation and reliability, the reliability and the validity of scales, how to do that, how to establish that, and the sample sizes you need and the statistics you need. They're all in this paper. And so I would, let me know. It'll probably be out in probably a month. By August, sometime in August, this paper will be out. But if you want the paper, I'm happy to email it to you. You just got to email me. harold.koenig@duke.edu. Okay, that's about it. I've enjoyed talking to you about this fascinating subject. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to stop recording.